This is a quick guide to Voisin Bombers of World War I. From the start of the war to the end, they were a staple of the Allied light bomber force over the Western Front and other theatres. They have the distinction of achieving the first air-to-air shoot-down of an enemy aircraft and of forming the first dedicated bomber squadrons. These aircraft were the product of early French aviation pioneers Gabriel and Charles Voisin. Born in 1880 and 1882 respectively, they became interested in aviation while still in their teens, transitioning from large box kites to gliders around about 1898. Their work with gliders, inspired by the likes of Clément Ader, Octave Chanute, and Lawrence Hargrave, brought them some recognition and led to a partnership with Louis Blériot in 1904. After the failure of the Blériots 2, 3, and 4, and the subsequent breakup with Louis Blériot, they hired draftsman Maurice Collier, and in 1906 formed Appareil d'Aviation les Frères Voisin, becoming the first manufacturer of aeroplanes. Their purpose was twofold. The first was to build the often bizarre, complicated, and generally unsuccessful designs of rich amateurs, and thus gain sufficient capital to develop their own designs. This is where confusion arises regarding Voisin aircraft in general, as they were named for the purchaser rather than assuming a consistent and easily trackable nomenclature. The Voisin name would appear in small print under the buyers. Early builds include the Florency ornithopter, Henri Camferet's Boucher-powered biplane, and Léon de Lagrange's biplane. By August 1907 they had amassed an impressive body of work that included parts for the Ville de Paris dirigible and an unsuccessful helicopter, of all things, for the Russian Prince Chelmiky. What can be regarded as something as a breakthrough, although in reality the consequence of design evolution, was the Henri Farman I, which was based on the de Lagrange biplane. The increasingly distinctive look that has come to be associated with the Voisins had now been established. That is, a box kite-type biplane with biplane rubber surfaces and a forward canard. The engine was positioned behind the pilot in a pusher position. This was, and is, often known as a Farman-type configuration due to the subsequent success of the Farman brothers. Voisin designs continued to be manufactured in a bewildering plethora that space and time preclude covering in the detail that they really deserve. Tragedy struck in 1912 when Charles Voisin died in an automobile accident. The two brothers had been close, and Gabriel was greatly affected. However, he continued to expand the business started by the pair under the name Société Anonyme des Aéroplanes Jet Voisin. Development culminated, for the purposes of this presentation, in the Type L-series that saw the greatest production both by Voisin, other French firms, and by other countries, numbering in excess of 6,000 by the end of World War I. The L-series, possibly better known as the Voisins 1 through 10, were the result of a series of developments for the French military commencing in 1910. Through a series of iterations, these had developed into a curious-looking design. Rather reminiscent of a baby's perambulator with wings, they were of tubular steel construction, making them quite rugged. They were of two-seater pusher type. Unusually for two-seaters, the observer was seated behind the pilot, with the exception of cannon-armed aircraft where seating was reversed. The canard, so distinctive in the 1907 aircraft, had been removed, leaving the aircraft with a wedge-shaped nose. The landing gear was an odd four-wheel arrangement, not dissimilar to a tricycle undercarriage, but obviously with an extra wheel. A tail skid was fitted in what might be regarded as a belt braces, and both hands approached to landing. Certainly there are pictures of the Voisins resting on the tail skid, the two front wheels hanging out in mid-air. However, the purpose of the skid was to slow down the aircraft after landing. Later versions removed this and utilized drum brakes on the rear wheels. A strong, reliable general design, they advanced through increasingly powerful engines with the fuselage and wings modified to accommodate them. The Voisin 1 was equipped with a 70 horsepower Gnome rotary. The Voisin 2 an 80 horsepower Le Rhône. Apart from that, the two were essentially identical. As early as August of 1914, 4 escadrilles of the French Aéronautique Militaire were equipped with them for the purposes of artillery observation and reconnaissance. From November of 1914, however, they assumed the role of daylight bombers, carrying 60 kilograms of bombs mounted in or around the sides of the two-seater nacelle. The top speed was around 90 kilometers per hour. Quickly becoming obsolete, their follow-up was the Voisin 3, equipped with a 120 horsepower Salmson 9M radial engine and unequal span wings. For the first time it was armed not just with bombs, but with a Hotchkiss machine gun for the observer and mounted above the pilot and operated by the observer standing behind him. The bomb load increased to 91 kilograms. Top speed was 105 to 113 kilometers per hour, depending upon the engine and manufacturer. In September 1914, 3 escadrilles of Voisin 3s formed the first bomber group. Under the leadership of Commandant de Goy, their success was facilitated by only light opposition through the early months of 1915, leading to the formation of similar groups with the same purpose. Performing daylight raids, the Voisin quickly became obsolete, and from September 1915 the type was restricted to night bombing. This restriction applied to the follow-ups as well, as compared with their fighter opposition, they were quite vulnerable. On October 5, 1914, a Voisin 3, piloted by Sergeant Joseph France, with his mechanic Louis Queneau acting as an observer, was flying in the region of Jonchery-en-Vale. There they encountered a German Aviatic B-1 piloted by Sergeant Wilhelm Schlichting, with Lieutenant Fritz von Zangen acting as his observer. Attempting to shoot down the Aviatic with the machine gun, Queneau ran out of ammunition. Becoming aware that von Zangen was shooting back with a rifle, Queneau returned fire with his own rifle, hitting Schlichting. The Aviatic went out of control and crashed, killing both occupants. This was the first confirmed air victory. The most numerically successful of the Voisin bombers, something like 1,350 were produced by various manufacturers and flown by several different nations. Appearing and seeing operation during 1915, the Voisin 4 was very similar to the Voisin 3, but featured staggered wings, and the nacelle was modified to accommodate a 37 or 47 mm single-shot cannon for ground attack purposes. The observer's position was moved forwards in front of the pilot. Around 200 were manufactured. It was not so much a successor to the Voisin 3 as it was a complement. Another, not exactly a successor but a complement to the Voisin 3, was the Voisin 5. Once again, engine power increased using a 150 horsepower Salmson P9. Speed increased to around 119 km per hour. The Voisin 6 was essentially the same, including the engine, but power output increased slightly to 155 horsepower. The increased weight resulted in a strengthening of the undercarriage. These served alongside the Voisin 3. About 400 of both types saw service from late 1915 through 1916. Despite the more powerful engines, performance and bomb load were not substantially improved, and the rate of climb suffered. Another development that was not exactly successful was the Voisin 7. Essentially an enlarged Voisin 5, it was underpowered despite a more powerful 180 horsepower Renault 8G engine. By now the weight was starting to undermine potential improvements in performance, and only 100 were produced. By 1916 it seems clear, in retrospect, that the general design of the Voisin bombers had reached their limit. The Voisin 8 reflects this. Performance of the new 220 horsepower Peugeot did not increase the top speed, though the bomb load increased to 180 kilograms carried beneath the wings and nacelle. Some were armed with a cannon-armed nacelle featuring the same 37 or 47mm Hotchkiss as previously. Entering service in late 1916, over 1,100 were manufactured and saw out the war in secondary units. Despite the large numbers produced, the engines remained unreliable. In order to keep the nomenclature intact, it is worth mentioning the one-off Voisin 9, a lightened reconnaissance version of the Type 8. The penultimate version of the Voisin L-series bombers, a naming convention I have avoided because I find it confusing, was the Type 10. Intended as a replacement for the Type 8, it was equipped with a more reliable 300 horsepower Renault. Some sources say a 280 horsepower Renault. Performance was improved with a top speed of 135 km per hour and an increased bomb load of 300 kilograms. Introduced in late 1917, some were still in service in 1920. As before, there was a cannon-armed version for ground attack, though this was produced in limited numbers. A total of 900 were manufactured. A development of the Type 10 was the Type 11, with a more powerful 350 horsepower Panhard engine. However, only 10 were built, and it never saw service. This brings to an end the Voisin bombers of World War I that share a design path. They were a successful breed. Between 1914 and 1918, engine power increased by over 500%, bomb load by 500%, and top speed by 50%. With hiccups along the way, this is quite impressive. Wait a minute, I am sure someone is saying to themselves, what about the Voisin 12? This is really outside of the scope and purpose of this presentation, as it was quite a different aircraft. A large four-engined long-range pusher-puller design intended for carrying 800 kilograms of bombs, it was never ordered into production as the war ended, but apparently the test flights were quite successful. The only survivors of which I am aware are as follows. The Musée de l'Air et de l'Espace at Le Bourget near Paris has on display a Voisin 3 and the cannon-armed nacelle of a Voisin 10. A Voisin 8 is on display at the National Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C.